which was about how to create a 1,000,000-copy bestseller. Specifically, it was about how a particular women's fiction author, Carrie Lonsdale, and her agent and her editor at Amazon Publishing, which I've already mentioned once in this podcast, handled the launch of her first book, which is titled Everything We Keep. From this discussion, some real concepts stepped out or emerged, which I think are worth discussing. First of all, if I haven't made this clear already, we are not talking about people self-publishing their own books through KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing. What we're talking about is Amazon Publishing, which is a traditional publishing branch of the Amazon Corporation. They have something like 16 imprints. They're publishing more than 1,000 titles a year, and they are doing extremely well. This particular book was published by the Lake Union imprint, which is what handles women's fiction. Well, to be sure, Amazon Publishing, being connected to Amazon, the retailer that sells more than 50% of all books in the United States, has an advantage. But I think it's still worth trying to take some tips from what they're doing and how you might be able to learn from what they're doing, even if your book is not at Amazon Publishing, even if it's somewhere else, or if you published it yourself. First of all, the editor discussed a variety of approaches or techniques they're using to promote the book, but the takeaway from all of them is the same. The goal is to get the book in front of people who might potentially buy it, to increase the visibility. Now, Amazon Publishing can do things that you couldn't. For instance, the book was featured prominently in the Amazon First Reads program. It showed up in some special promotions. It showed up in people's feed for, other people who liked this book also liked this, that sort of thing. But the point was to make the book surface over and over again to millions of readers. And that's a technique they used to break out Carrie Lonsdale. Well, okay, you might not be able to get into the Amazon First Reads program, at least without spending a fortune. But there are other things you can do to increase your visibility, like Amazon ads, which, if handled well, can be a very good investment. Same thing for Facebook ads. In my experience, that's not quite as effective as Amazon ads. You're advertising at the place where people buy books, but it can still be useful. Newsletters, mailing lists, anything that gets your book cover in front of people is a good idea. Second thing that Lonsdale's agent talked about was ebook pricing. As you've probably noticed, the major traditional publishers are still pricing their ebooks higher than anybody else, typically about $10.99. And as I've reported before, in some cases, pricing them even higher than the hardcover edition of the book. That's too much. According to Lonsdale's agent, even $9.99 is too much. They're recommending $7.99 or even $5.99 to make it easier or more tempting for someone to try a new author. The goal, of course, for any debut author is to get the book into people's hands. Yes, you'd like to make money, but the goal is to get people to give the new author a try. And frankly, it probably makes better money sense too, which is what her agent said. They would much rather sell hundreds of thousands of copies of a cheaper ebook than sell a few thousand of a $12 book. That makes good economic sense. Those higher prices really only make sense for traditional publishers who wish ebooks would go away so that they could continue to thrive off print and traditional brick-and-mortar bookstores. Amazon Publishing, of course, does not have that slant since they are connected to the largest online retailer in the United States. The same agent also talked about marketing, and the author talked about all that she's doing to market via Facebook, and she's got her own email newsletter. Of course, you probably all got Facebook accounts. This is what really stood out to me. Lonsdale runs a so-called secret Facebook group just for her top and most devoted readers. She actively is recruiting new members, adds new members to it throughout a year. That's what the email newsletter is doing, among other things. I'm sure promoting the book too, but remember, she's only got one, so you need something to fill out those newsletters. She's turning those people into her super fans, who not only can be counted on to buy the next book, but also can help build the buzz for books before their release. They talked a little bit about author brand too, and consistency of product. They didn't think that was the most important thing out there. But then again, they did say it's important not to confuse people by having mixed messages, and talked about curating the Amazon author profile page so that all the books that are represented there are of the same type or would appeal to the same audience. You know, what's your bottom line here? Combine this with the previous article in the news section that said Amazon Publishing does the best with covers. Now you're seeing how they very effectively promote new authors, and I think you can take a few lessons away. First and foremost, the book is paramount. It's got to be a good book with real potential to grab and captivate readers, and you only get that by really good, careful, hard work and writing. Presumably this book had it, or Amazon Publishing wouldn't have even taken it, much less spent all this time and trouble on it. Then you give it a good cover. Then you give it a good price, which makes people willing to take a chance on it. Then you take out advertising or do other things, send out a newsletter over and over again, perhaps, in order to get it in front of people. You're active on social media, and ultimately, all these things will add up to the success you want, not only for your first book, but for every book you ever write. My interview this time is with Laurel Thomas, a longtime WriterCon friend, an experienced writer, and now, for the first time, a published novelist. I wanted to talk to her about what that first-time experience has been like, how the book came to be, how she wrote it, and draw from her experience. One word of note, I recorded this interview back on the WriterCon Cruise, so if you're hearing a little bit more than average noise in the background, that's why. But I don't think you'll have any trouble hearing what Laurel had to say. Laurel, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Bill. I'm thrilled to be here.
Okay, first question I always ask. If you could give one piece of advice to an aspiring writer, what would it be?
Go to WriterCon Conference.
I like that. That's good advice.
Yeah, truly it made
Because why?
Well, it made all the difference. Switching genres, I had a complete novel, but really, I was ready just to shelve it because I thought, it's a first novel and it probably needs more work. It had been through, 2 or 3 editing processes. Mm-hmm. And I just, when I presented River's Call in a pitch session at WriterCon, it did not go over well. It was kind of a difficult time to hear that premise shot down. But what I learned from that particular class was that the ones who were leading it said over and over, this is just focusing on premise. It's not condemning your book or telling you that you have a terrible idea. It's just the premise. So I learned that at a writer's conference, and I got braver as I realized that there are specific parts to the craft that you have to be willing not to do very well and continue to take what you learn and put it to work. So River's Call was actually, it came from an opening paragraph session with Allie Robertson.
Like writing prompts or something like that?
Well, Allie Robertson said, I would like everyone to bring their first paragraph of their completed novel, and we're going to talk about them. What works, what doesn't work. So she read mine, and so at the very end, I came up to Allie and I said, this is my opening, my paragraph. Would you be interested in seeing the entire manuscript? And she said yes.
Wow.
So.
Keep that paragraph.
Exactly. So it was a tedious process, but really valuable as far as learning a first novel.
River's Call is your new novel, but you'd been writing before that. Talk about that a little bit. How'd you get started?
Okay. Well, I will say that I did a lot of free work for a long time because I loved to write and it was easy. If someone needed something written, I wrote it.
Like Friends or what?
Friends and several different venues. But when I got involved with Melanie, I realized that there's a professional part of writing that needs to be learned. And just to, when you said being shy doesn't sell books,
right?
I wrote it down. That's it. So when I learned that I could do what I've been doing for years and make money, that was great. So I had to learn to look at guidelines, and I had to learn to work with other people with ghostwriting. Sometimes it was lovely. Sometimes it was horrible. I learned how to write a contract ahead of time and to be sure that I didn't repeat the mistakes that I had done before with other projects that ended up being awful.
How did you meet up with the Write Well, Sell Well crew? Well,
that's a funny story because I knew Melanie Henry from church. And I think it was actually Melanie that said, we need an administrator for our Write Well, Sell Well conference, which was before we met you. And she said, I heard you're a good administrator. So I lied through my teeth and said, yes, I am. I am a good administrator, and yes, I'll do it. So I mean, talk about a high learning curve, but, putting that conference together and working with that group as well as working with WriterCon has just been amazing. I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Well, Melanie must have sensed that there was potential there then, because as anybody who's been to WriterCon knows, you're behind the registration desk, and there's a reason. That's a job I don't want. You can have it, but you do it wonderfully. So that worked out perfectly. So you wrote, but River's Call is your first published novel, right?
Correct.
And it's historical fiction? Tell us about it.
Yes. Well, working with a publisher, I, of course, had not done that with fiction before. And so we were going along with one particular genre, and then Allie, the editor or the agent, said, this has to be historical fiction in Wild Rose because it was written in the 80s. I was like, what? The 80s are historical fiction?
Yeah, I know.
But anyway, so that's how they build it, and that's how they promoted it as historical fiction.
So tell us what happens in the book.
Well, the book is about a young girl, Missy, who lives in Mississippi. Sorry, I just noticed that those two kind of rhymed. But it's a rural part of Mississippi, and it draws from the fact that my mom remarried when I was probably 6 to a Southern gentleman. And the first time that we went to Georgia to meet them, I came as a girl from Minnesota to Georgia. And I can tell you, it was such a shock. Being a stepchild, for one thing, was a shock. But then moving into this place, it was like alien. I couldn't understand what they said. I couldn't understand a Southerner's accent. So the gist of that is that that particular time brought such strong, emotive memories that I thought, I'm going to set this novel exactly in the place where I remember what it smelled like. I remembered what Georgia smelled like. I remembered the rain that came every afternoon about 3:30. So for me, when I was writing Missy, I wanted that really strong sense of setting, and did a lot of research about living near a river and how rivers, the dangers of rivers, which for Missy, the metaphor was, you never just jump in the river. If you know rivers, you throw a rock, you throw something to determine where that current is
Right.
and what's